Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the Silky Smooth Sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in Houston.
And today we are going to be talking about a pretty common topic that you hear about us we talk about on the Green and Red podcast. We're going to be talking about environmental organizations, like what we like to call it the nonprofit industrial complex. We're going to be talking about the Sierra Club and lots of politics and things like that around the Sierra Club. And joining us today is Michelle Mascarenhas. I hope I said that right. And Hopkins. Earlier this year, the Sierra Club went through a restructuring, which led to layoffs. It's been a very controversial issue in environmental circles. Michelle and Hop are two folks who were sort of went through that restructuring and went through that process and have been talking about it and speaking about it. Sierra Club is just, one of the oldest, largest environmental groups in the U.S. It has a very problematic history, from being founded by racist John Muir to things that we've heard more recently from former executive director Carl Pope, doing things like promoting corporate greenwashing. And so Hop is the former director of organizational transformation at the Sierra Club. He's a longtime activist, social media strategist, scholar. He's been involved in movements from HIV and AIDS to anti-globalization, food sovereignty, anti-displacement, and clean energy transition. Most recently, he has been a climate justice fellow and adjunct professor at Antioch University. He's down in LA. And then Michelle is the former national director of campaigns at the Sierra Club. Michelle was the co-director of Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project, which supported the formation of the Climate Justice Alliance, the Reclaim Our Power Utility Justice Project. Michelle also has worked as a union organizer and organized farm to school projects, and is based here in Berkeley, same as me. And I just want to welcome y'all to Green and Red, and thank you for joining us today. I've been looking forward to this episode.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
Good to be here. And thanks, Bob.
Pleasure.
And before we get into questions, I know, Michelle, that you had wanted to say something real quick.
I just wanted to sort of, dedicate in a way this episode to a friend, comrade, mentor, and now ancestor, Al Weinreb, who is a long time kind of red, black, and green, activist for decades and decades, who just passed last week. Folks, I just encourage folks to look up Al's readings or writings. He was an amazing writer and scholar, but also just really feet on the ground, head in the clouds, but like hands deeply in the earth and like with the people, and worked a lot on helping us understand this moment of this crucial energy transition and climate crisis. So just gratitude to our ancestor, Al Weinreb.
Rest in power.
Yes.
And, actually kind of speaking about that and Al's legacy, both of you come out of environmental justice and global justice and climate justice. And so, maybe kind of kicking it off, what did you hope to accomplish by working at the Sierra Club? Coming out of probably more like left of the Sierra Club sort of movements.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Hop joined earlier than I did. So, part of my joining the Sierra Club was recognizing that our, justice movements, environmental justice, racial justice, kind of global justice movements had been building a shared analysis of the crisis, really understanding the roots of the climate crisis more deeply, and that we had come together around this shared framework of the climate crisis is not just a crisis of needing to electrify everything, but instead it's about shifting from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And so it felt like with folks like Hop and others, there was a very strong BIPOC leadership that had been making great strides in the Sierra Club, I would say, over the past decade towards this kind of a framework and supporting the organization in kind of being part of a united front. And so that was what drew me to the Sierra Club, that and being recruited for this, crucial position of the National Director of Campaigns, which we all saw as, really critical to kind of starting to solve the problem of how philanthropy is driving the movement through funneling dollars into, campaigns and programs that then, create the whole shape of the movement, rather than the people who are part of these organizations and, membership bases really coming up with and driving that. So, for me, it was and still is, I believe, really crucial that the Sierra Club be continue to be a strong, grassroots based organization that is organizing, especially white folks, which is its traditional base, towards a North Star of a just economic transformation, that can actually address the crisis, that multiple crises that are all connected, that we find ourselves in.
Well, one, thanks a lot for having us on board to talk about this. And I know the focus is about the Sierra Club, but I think both Michelle and I want to express that this is broadly should be taken as an analytical view of the larger nonprofit industrial complex, regardless of what sector it's in. Many of the same things that are happening at the Sierra Club over the past decade are the same things that are happening in many of the other movement sectors that the nonprofit industrial complex overlaps with. So we might be taking some examples, but I think they should be much broadly be taken about what's going on in the broader movement, which was a reason why we engaged Brooke and Convergence in doing the article, was really to try to make sense of the moment that we were in, using our experience with Sierra Club as an example. And as Michelle said, and I'll try not to be repetitive, it was I'd gotten involved 20 some odd years ago trying to fight what we talked about as the greenhouse effect. And when I was looking around at organizations and wanted to have a larger impact and figure out what governance actually looked like, I looked at the Sierra Club. It's the largest, oldest environmental organization on the planet, 64 chapters, a governance body of about 7,000 leaders across the country making decisions on a day-to-day basis. And with a base somewhere around between 3 and 4 million at this point. It was one of the largest bases outside of organized labor, and it has a right-sized influence in the movement it helped spark. So, wanting to take a look at how we could intervene in a movement that had some really problematic origins and some negative impacts on communities of color and the environmental movement, as well as the climate justice and environmental justice movement, was really trying to get in and understand what that looked like, and is there a way in which we could bring them in deeper alignment with those movements I spoke about, the environmental movement, the environmental justice, progressive wings of the environmental movement. And also we wanted to figure out what it was like to try to organize white people against white supremacy. It was the largest base of mostly white environmentalists in the country, but it was also inside of an organization that had some had taken problematic positions, and left to its own devices would most likely continue to take problematic positions on issues that were critical to moving us to a different place of justice as it relates to addressing climate change. So we looked at that and wanted to figure out how could we actually govern at scale, what it actually looked like, how could we actually begin to move and build organizations to the size and scale that we actually needed to make the appropriate momentum in order to make the types of policy and movement changes we needed in order to get to a more just a just world that we were looking for. And as I said in the article, I've been heavily influenced by some other forms of organization like the Black Panther Party, the Brown Berets, American Indian Movement, and their ability to move their agendas across geographies by having chapter structures. And with 64 chapters, a chapter in every state, I didn't know much about that at that scale. And so I wanted to get in there and look like, what did Little D democracy actually look like at that level in somewhat of a federated organizational structure, where you had a national unit and staff across the country in service of volunteer-based chapters in states taking on local and regional issues, culminating to national level support for particular campaigns.
Seems like this current situation started, I guess, in the spring. I remember reading something about it. Do you want to kind of talk a little bit about what's kind of this kind of more, what was it, like 6 months ago, or not even 6 months ago, probably. I don't know what to call it, a crisis or situation or conditions or whatever, but it seems like since the spring something happened there, and this is kind of created some problems.
Yeah, well, let me start. I would say it goes much farther back than that. It's not just institutionally or situated within the Sierra Club. This is a much larger phenomenon that was happening inside the social, political, and cultural context of the United States, which was before we had this anti-woke movement. There was actually the movement against CRT, critical race theory, which the right wing had began attacking, which, of course, people familiar with that got conflated. It wasn't something that was being taught in middle school or high schools. It was actually something that was taught at the collegiate level, which didn't make a difference to the right wing in their attacks around it, but really trying to go at any critical analysis of racialized formations, gender formations, et cetera, inside the United States, starting back with like the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, and what that actually meant for the enslavement of African people, and the genocide of indigenous people, right? That telling of the history was very problematic to conservative forces. And I would say both on the right wing and within liberal to progressive organizations, because it threatened the status quo in a way in which they were not willing to accept. So going far back as to that, this movement against, I think, telling a more liberated, honest telling of history, both historically from the United States perspective and internal to those specific organizations around those founders, was being pushed back. Then it was a response. Moving from the attack against critical race theory to this attack on wokeness manifests itself within our own institution. And over the course of the last several years, I would say the conservative wing within our institution had been making noise about our own truth-telling, about John Muir, Canton, and a number of other founders who were part and very instrumental into movements like the eugenics movement. And that telling didn't sit well. So as we move forward to the anti-woke movement, there were several board elections within our institution, and I feel that the more conservative elements of our institution began to take more seats on the board and gain more influence. So leading to this resetting of the chess table in some ways. And so they were able to bring in new people with different ideas that were contrary to, I believe, what we've been doing over the past decade in terms of really trying to get the organization to come to grips with not just the racist history of the United States and its formation, the racist formation of the environmental movement, but also Sierra Club's role in helping promote policies and campaigns that were problematic and less beneficial to Black and Brown communities.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just pick up on then, the last 6 months in particular, as Hop has given the longer history, but for me, coming in only a year ago, it actually was quite a shock to see how, at least on the staff and chapter level, and membership level, what I had seen was a real shift to, an anti-rape to the kind of values that the board had adopted, around anti-racism, balance, collaboration, transformation, justice, and we were doing that in all kinds of ways, including, working to be transparent and accountable at across the organization. And so what happened really in like January, February of this year, or started in February, like was, for me, I'll say like pretty shocking, the level of sort of affront to the way we had been moving and the direction that we'd been going, the lack of transparency that took place or that has continued to kind of play out in the way that this restructuring done in the name of budget cut has occurred. And, there's been just a massive impact on the organization's ability, I believe, to even just carry out its work. Anyone who knows anything about institutional or organizational transformation knows, like, you can't just upheaval, turn completely over the organization and expect it to figure out how to suddenly function again the next morning. So there's just a lot of work that has to be done, a lot of new ground that has to be laid, a lot of trust that has to be rebuilt. Once the organization actually gets back onto a justice-oriented track, I would say. And we don't even really know the numbers of how many staff were laid off, who and what, just as an example, I was laid off on May 10th and given like 30 minutes basically to like send whatever emails I needed to send before my email was shut down, right? So I sent an email to my unit to let them know. I have there's 100 people that I was responsible for, to let them know, like, hey, y'all, I'm not here anymore, right? Like, just as an example of kind of how these changes are happening, because I knew that there wasn't going to be a lot of, there wasn't already a lot of transparency and explanation of what was going on and why it was happening and where we were moving towards, in contrast to the way we had been doing things, which, was doing, real like deeper organizational transformation, which, I was told as I was hired, like, don't look at this as a year of work and you can be out, this has to be like a 5-year at least project, because as we know, like these shifts take time. And we were making strides that I just think it's a real, it's a real shame at this time on the clock of the world that we've kind of done this somersault and, everything's topsy-turvy now.
Yeah,
Well,
I would just add, I think it went from like a period of, and like, a lot of this work was happening before Michelle and I got there. I've been there at the organization for 9 years, so 1 year as a consultant and 8 years as staff. And there are plenty of people before us, and while the time that we both have been there, that have paid the price for trying to be on the road of justice inside of the Sierra Club and other movements that we are connected to. So to put it into a more specific context of that trajectory that I was laying out inside the Sierra Club, we had been following prior to the summer of 2020 with the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. We'd already been working inside the organization to get it to a place of recognizing that the climate crisis was a product of the legacy of colonialism, slavery, and racist policies and structures, right? Those are pretty significant places to get the organization to really begin to examine its own history in relationship to how public lands had been preserved, and what that meant for Indigenous communities and what that meant for Black and Brown communities. To get to a place where, and it wasn't so much the restructuring itself. Organizations restructure all the time. It's the process by which they restructure. And it's the same thing about moving towards climate just transition. right? Justice can't be an afterthought because it's never thought of. And in this process, it seemed in stark contrast to the way in which transparency was happening around budgeting, decision making, and participatory democratic processes that the organization was internalizing and beginning to incorporate in mass. To go from that to one of the first steps of the new administration's decision making about the restructuring was to get rid of the equity department. So without any real plan, or at least that none that we knew of, and we were some of the most senior leaders inside the institution that had been on this track of developing and helping move the equity work in the organization, without any plan for how that work was going to continue, where the funding was going to come from, and how it was going to be incorporated to every aspect of our work. So to go from that to the other side of the coin with nothing, as Michelle said, was pretty stark and traumatic for many folks.
Did the board, when they announced this restructuring, say it was due to kind of economic issues, economic problems? Were they saying they weren't getting enough like fundraising or?
Yeah, I mean, there were budget gaps. And I mean, Hop can tell you there were years and years of actually, there was a BIPOC committee that was formed in, was it 2020?
Yes, 2020.
That named that, you know, cuts would need to be made, shifts would have to be done. And so, but the organization pushed it further and further downfield. So yes, it was said to be about budget cuts, but, you know, I mean, there were ways to solve that budget gap that wouldn't have created such traumatic and like tumultuous impacts.
Yeah, as I said before, it wasn't the restructuring necessarily was a problem. We had forecasted that years before. It's just a process by which the restructuring happened. And, you know, for folks who are working inside the nonprofit industrial complex, and let's just be real, most of us who consider ourselves progressives or leftists are probably in some form of 501c3. Very few of us are fortunate enough to exchange our labor in this capitalist market in an institution that isn't part of a larger systemic structure, right? And so when we looked at what needed to happen, there's a way in which to do that, which would, as Michelle mentioned, could minimize the amount of trauma and continue to prioritize what we've been working on previously. And I think for most people who are inside the nonprofit industrial complex, look at your organization's budget, not what they say and put on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter in terms of response to something, but what is the budget actually saying? Because it tells a story. The narrative of your justice work inside your institution can be told by reviewing the priorities inside your budget. And and up until this point, we had just developed our organization's first ever set of values. The organization's 139 years old. It had not had a set of codified values until then. We had just come out of our first strategic plan. The organization didn't have a strategic plan prior to a few years ago. We were going into our second strategic plan and into our strategic framework. So there were a number of ways in which we were trying to institutionalize our justice orientation that now seem to be up in air, that have been deprioritized, or it's not clear where they're being prioritized in our budgets. So again, for those folks who are in nonprofit organizations, and you're trying to make sure that these changes are sustainable, make sure they get codified into the organization's budget, because that's what's really going to keep the work moving, even when there are these shifts, because we know there are going to be shifts. But that doesn't mean your priorities need to change drastically, or you completely wipe the board. There ought to be a transition. There ought to be a way in which we think about how do we actually sustain this work through these tumultuous times in order to keep the organization on the trajectory that it's on.
One question I have is that, the Sierra Club had some recent, the new leadership came in, before this, and I'm that person was probably Ben Jealous was probably hired by the board, and I'm wondering if is there any, what role did he play? Was this coming from the board, or is this coming from the new leadership? Or I mean, it could also be speculation, but
I'll let Michelle take that. I was unfortunately not in a lot of those meetings, but as one would expect when a new director comes in, they have some say on what happens moving forward. I would imagine it's not just one person, but a number of decision makers in there. But once again, I wasn't in those rooms and I don't know exactly how it all went down.
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly, I mean, I can speak from my own experience, which was, I was the director of the campaigns unit, which brought in the most 501c3, funding. So I was responsible for the largest portion of the C3 budget and or carrying out that work, I should say. And I went from being instrumental in the budgeting process that we were doing as the program department leadership team to being completely cut out of the process and out of the rooms. So, that happened basically overnight when Ben came on, in late February. I think like Hop said, he had a very clear idea of, bringing in people he trusted, and he did a lot of that. There's a lot of new folks that have joined senior leadership, who he's worked with before, and a lot of folks, who are not there anymore, like Hop and I and others. And, I want to name, especially Hop referred to this, in what he was saying, that there's a lot of Black women that have been really working to put the Sierra Club on, a more transparent, equitable, democratic, and justice-oriented path for years and years, who are gone now. And I think that's really important to name, because I think it can be, what one story that's being told right now is Sierra Club has the first Black executive director in its history, which could have been a big, sign of progress if it were continuing to move the organization in the right direction. But the fact that that has come at a cost of losing people who had been moving the organization on that trajectory should be a real marker for folks that story is not true.
How many people were laid off or fired, or however they term it?
Yeah, we don't have access to the actual numbers. We think it's something about somewhere over 100 people were significantly impacted. But again, I think the call for transparency is there and hasn't been answered. So that's really important.
Were these most likely people who were kind of more involved in environmental justice or kind of those kind of issues, justice issues?
Well, the environmental justice, the Healthy Communities campaign was disbanded. Yeah. Along with the equity team, there were other campaigns and so forth that were, but, especially, the environmental justice campaign. And I'll say that there were complications with how the Sierra Club has always sort of siloed different parts of the organization. So there did need to be work to integrate environmental justice and climate justice across our campaigns and across the work of the organization. But yeah, I don't think you do that by just, getting rid of everybody on the ground who has built the trust with communities, like right away.
Yeah.
One question I have is that, the Sierra Club is unionized, maybe even by two different unions, if I recall correctly. How has the union responded to this?
Yeah, I mean,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, Sierra Club is unionized by two unions, Progressive Workers Union and SEA, Sierra Employee Alliance. And I think it's been very challenging. The union, I can't speak for the union, of course, but I think the union has been very challenged by the way that the leadership has done kind of an about face in terms of, collegial management, labor relations that had before been the way of the Sierra Club. There's just been a lot of negotiations and back and forth, filings of unfair labor practices and et cetera, like, so I think that's been very challenging.
So just to put it in context, the Sierra Club at this point, and I don't know the exact numbers right now, where the employment levels exactly were, but somewhere between 725 to 800 staff, paid staff, both at the national level, including chapter staff. And so folks have been let go across the institution in almost every department. And again, restructuring isn't something that's new, but the process by which the restructuring happened is what's the most jarring, because it is diametrically opposed to how we actually got to this place in terms of there being transparency, broad input. It's a completely different decision-making orientation that's happening inside the organization that is counter to what had been happening and developing and building over the last 10 years, both internally, having some impacts, and externally with our partners on the ground and in communities. And so I think that's the crux of the challenge of what's happening. Many relationships built at the speed of trust that took decades to build because of the very problematic way in which the Sierra Club had entered into communities previously and kind of ran roughshod over community will and desire for work, not consultating about particular campaigns, and then kind of airlifting in and deciding kind of how that was. And many of us came in and reoriented that work to say, no, we've actually got to enter the communities in partnership and relationship by first listening to communities and seeing what's going on with them. Who are the leaders that are already, we can't go into Columbus, all this environmental work as if there was no work ever being done around it. There's inherent leaders and organizational structures within these communities already addressing these issues. And we ought to be in a different type of relationship with them rather than dictating what types of policies and campaigns begin to come around. And so these shifts represent a pretty significant shift, because many of those people who've been engaged in developing those relationships over that time are no longer present. So there's a huge gap in between what's happening now and what's happening on the ground and who's there to help. Like Michelle said, many of us from one day to the next were there one day and not the next day. And so there wasn't a real opportunity to transfer those relationships and to build that type of trust, or to shore up those relationships in a way that would then lead, because many communities ain't going to mess with the Sierra Club. They've already made the decision because of many of the things like the population bomb, a book written by one of our members, encouraged by one of our directors, that really put the blame for environmental degradation on both communities of color nationally and internationally, right? It's organizational anti-immigration stance. And many communities remember those things. And so it's taken a lot of time to rebuild those relationships, actually make amends for the trauma that was caused by those decisions, and then get back to a place of consultative leadership with those communities. And I think that is all in question right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the changes, with the restructuring that has happened, and it's had an impact on environmental justice work going on at Sierra Club, is there still potential for environmental justice work to be happening there? Is it still happening? I know both of you aren't on the inside anymore, but just from what you've seen. And then also, this also begs a bigger question, which is, how does the left, whether it's the institutional left or whether it's the grassroots left, respond to the climate crisis, which is like the big elephant in the room?
Yeah, Michelle and I aren't internal to the organization anymore, but we're still connected to staff, volunteers, and members who are still connected directly to the organization. And, we're connected to those movements that we helped in part bring into relationship with the Sierra Club, as well as those who were pre-existing in relationship with the Sierra Club. And this work is too important. And as we said in the article, we can't give up on United Fronts. And there is a role for organizations and institutions like the Sierra Club, whether, when the mainstream environmental movement, the progressive wings of the environmental movement, environmental justice, climate, to be in relationship with each other in order to move to a place where we can secure the types of wins at the scale and magnitude that we need in order to make interventions towards addressing climate change and getting closer to liberation. So that work is continuing. Michelle and I are in relationship and conversations with folks internal, external, to figure out what that work looks like in the short, middle, and long term. It's yet to be determined on the direction of the organization and its ultimate orientation towards the previous justice work and in response to what's happening within the context of the U.S. social movements inside the United States right now.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I'll just respond a little bit to your second question, Scott, like in terms of what should the US left be doing in response to the climate crisis. I mean, we have to understand this crisis as a crisis of governance, right? It is the crisis of taking the decision-making out of the hands of the peoples who are most impacted by those decisions. And so what I believe we really need is like a move towards permanently organized communities, which means we are organizing to build our collective self-governance capacity to stop what's harming us, stop what's killing us, stop what's destroying the life support systems that we depend on, and by building the new, by building the ways of taking care of each other, of the land, in ways that directly confront the system that's robbing us of our capacity to do that, right? That's robbing us of the land and of our ability to control our own labor, and instead applying that, towards regenerative economies, like so. So yeah, and I actually think that Sierra Club structure, as to Hop's wise point, like the chapter structure really provides for that kind of a vehicle for permanently organized communities. It's kind of like it lines up very well, right? Once the Sierra Club is doing the kind of anti-racism, just transition, like education across chapters, across members, to make sure those spaces are safe and like vibrant spaces that are moving towards that kind of a North Star, which I believe members are doing. Like members are helping to lead that kind of work in their chapters, across the organization. Like that's part of why I was there, it was like, and I heard that from people time and time again, in rooms that I would enter not knowing a soul. Like people would come up to me and say, like, we're so glad you're here because we've been trying to move the organization in this direction. And then I would say to the question about like, what do folks do who are in these institutions, right? Hop and I are not inside the Sierra Club anymore, but we know many folks. I mean, the folks that are organized in unions are really working to create an organized response and push the organization towards transformative goals, right? They're not only, I think unions can be sometimes seen as just focused on bread and butter issues, but our experience of the unions at the Sierra Club they're there, workers are there to transform the economy, and so the union can be a really strong and important partner and a place for folks to, a place for leftists to do that work. And I think we also need, when we're in those institutions, political homes outside of the institution to help hold us accountable and keep us tethered to a greater North Star, because it is very alienating and disorienting to be in these large nonprofit institutions that feel like a world of their own.
Yeah, that's great. And I would say, to Michelle's point about the unions, the Progressive Workers Union, they've changed their name. I think it used to be something like the John Muir Local. They went through a process of, as the organization was reevaluating its relationship to its founders, changed its name. And I would say to leftists inside of these organizations, try to start a union. I think the PW has a mission to try to unionize a large portion of the environmental sector. And that's one test of your organization's commitment to justice, is just try to start a union and see what happens. Because that will give you some kind of idea of the real orientation of your organization. Of course, do your homework and figure out if that's the intervention to make at that time, or if there's particular moves that need to be made to get to that place. But that's one place of trying to just organize your workplace. Another one I'd say is develop, kind of get grounded in the moment that we're in, and get grounded in the organization that you're in and what it thinks its role is, and not just by yourself, but with the group of people, try to figure out what could the role look like and how do you play a role in the larger struggle for liberation, regardless of what it is that you're doing. And I think developing hypotheses about how you might then be able to organize yourself, and for us, we were looking at what if we were able to organize white middle class environmentalists to develop an anti-racist kind of root cause analysis of the climate catastrophe. Could we then create the conditions that didn't exist before that would allow the Sierra Club to move into a large united front with the progressive wing of the environmental climate justice movements? And by doing so, could we move white middle class environmentalists to an anti-racist orientation that allowed them then to see their role to take on white supremacy front and center as a way of addressing many of the other social ills by having developed that root cause analysis. And then figuring out ways in which to test those hypotheses that you come up with. And I think also understanding what the bigger we is that we're talking about here, who's your we, and who's the bigger we inside the progressive movement. And I would say that, that's the larger array of forces who are opposed against extractivism, sacrifice, and disposability, right? And inside that bigger we, everyone isn't going to be anti-imperialist. Everyone isn't going to be anti-capitalist. You're going to have liberal institutions and liberal activists and organizers inside that bigger we. And if we kind of move away from a little bit of the purity politics and think everyone's got to be this or everyone's got to be that, we just don't have those numbers just yet. We haven't created the conditions to organize and work with folks to move them to a place of that analytical position. And we can take some lessons in history where we've had broader we's that could take on these issues. And I think we've got to get back to a place of really trying to figure out who the bigger we is and organizing them in such a way to get a united front so we can not just deal with the attacks that are coming at us, but actually move towards building the new as we're resisting and fighting the bad.
One question I have is, I think it's in the Convergence article. There's like mention of the new leadership's connection to green capital, which is, could we talk actually about that a little bit? Is that something that we're going to be seeing? I know, they just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually seems to be a big funnel of green capital into like lots of different industries, renewables, yay, and, fuel efficient vehicles, kind of yay, sometimes not, but also into nuclear and other false solutions like that. And I'm just wondering what you see as the role of green capital in both like an institution like the Sierra Club and in this sort of like greater challenge, to the climate crisis.
Yeah. So look, we all feel it, right? We feel it in our bodies right now. The moment on the planet is markedly different than even 3 years ago. It's clear from the economy and the way that things are rapidly shifting. It's clear from the fact that every county in the country has had a climate disaster now, on and on and on, right? And so, if we understand that as like transition is inevitable, justice is not, the question is who's going to lead that transition? And, gray capital, fossil fuel is one possibility. Green capital, which in this case, when I talk about that, I'm saying like the forces of capital that are just like wielding capital still as power over to dictate and determine the development of the economy, right? Towards, in this case, quote unquote, green outcomes, like, for example, electrifying everything, right? what that means to electrify everything is, in my view, to electrify exploitation and extraction, right? Like, it is going to continue to drive an extractive economy in maybe some new directions, sure, but it's investing some of the last precious resources that have been extracted from Black people, Indigenous people, the land, immigrants, and using that to direct the development of the economy in a particular way that continues to perpetuate inequity and growth, like at any cost. So that's when I talk about green capital, I'm talking about like, the fact that Oxy Petroleum just bought the largest carbon capture, direct air capture company in the world. So now does it become a green, company because it's cleaning up, quote unquote, the environment?
BP's going into solar, right? Brion
Sure,
Petroleum.
yeah, the largest solar companies are, right? So similarly, hydrogen is being talked about, right, as this new green, potential, but all it's doing in California is extending the life of gas pipelines, right? The gas companies are fighting for it, right? So carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, like all these like geoengineering fixes are now what's on the agenda as the ways to extend the life of this extractive economy, right? And that's what we have to really see is like, we cannot at this point maintain and extend the life either of the fossil fuel industry or of, I would say, utility scale energy systems, right? We have to move from centralized to decentralized, democratized, diversified forms of energy system where people are actually more in relationship to the way we use land, the ways we get energy. So like energy democracy versus centralized utility systems, right? And I guess I want to say one more thing is that in this transition, what we're seeing, what we know is that there are going to be shocks increasingly as we're also experiencing slides, right? So what Hop was talking about, of how are we going to make these shifts, right? It's really important to be working with folks where they're at right now, but also understand that as the shocks happen, just as 2020 brought a real like awakening and racial reckoning moment for white people and non-Black people, right, to understand the crisis in a different way, there are going to continue to be shocks that provide for psychic breaks and openings and moving towards the kinds of transformation that is necessary. And that's what we have to be ready for, because we're in relationship to groups of people who the ground has been readied for them to start to pivot and become part of the leadership of developing permanently organized communities, that are actually organized to respond and win the kinds of shifts that we've always needed, but we need now more than ever. Hop, you want to say anything about green capital?
Well, what I would say is I think that we need to begin to, take it upon ourselves to think about what does it actually look like to move towards a just transition and away from extractive systems that demand sacrifice and exploitation. And what does it look like to move to systems and structures that value people and the planet in ways in which are regenerative in nature? And that's not just in terms of, that's all encompassing. How does it impact the way in which we make decisions? How does it impact the way in which we have transparency about the economic decisions that are being made? How does it impact the way in which we decide where things are going to happen and how they're going to happen? That's a larger part of what this was talking about. When a fossil fuel heavy corporation buys a quote unquote green company, you've done nothing but transfer the one particular framework to a framework that has the potential to be something different, but actually is using the same operating platform and structure that it was based on before, which is hyper exploitation, sacrifice, and exploitation. So what have you done different than you did before? And I think having some of the same thinking, same people, and same institutional formation in charge of the green transition is not going to get us anything different than we had before. It's just going to put a new package on an old product. And that's what I want to say. And I think in terms of thinking about institutions like the Sierra Club or wherever it is that your listeners are listening from, it's important to move them into relationship, to align them in relationship with progressive forces within the climate justice and environmental justice movement. And by doing so, at least our hope was, and we saw benefit from this, was that it would have an impact on other large, small institutions, on philanthropy, on elected officials, in order to move them towards more progressive positions. Land back and reparations are inseparable from one another. We're not going to get one without the other. Climate justice is inseparable from racial justice. We're not going to get one without the other, and we're not going to get them with what we have arrayed in front of us now. We actually need to bring more people into alignment and into formation, as we like to say, in order to secure these victories. And that takes a lot of hard work, because securing those victories are going to mean improvements to the material conditions for working class, working poor, trans, women, people of color, indigenous communities. And we can't afford to leave these institutions alone. Leaving them alone means that they're going to continue to get organized into systems and structures of white supremacy.
We are out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. I think that was a good way to close. I want to thank Michelle and Hop for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. Folks, you've been listening to the Green and Red podcast. We've been talking about the Sierra Club, the nonprofit industrial complex, and how these institutions are facing the climate crisis and not always doing it well. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. If you like what you're hearing, check out greenandredpodcast.org and hit support and make a donation or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Michelle and Hop, it's been a pleasure having you. I've been looking forward to this episode for a while. So glad you're able to join us today.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Thanks for having us.
Yep.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day now.
And everyone else out there, misbehave and make a lot of trouble. Talk to y'all later.
Take care.
Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Everybody wade. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? God's gonna trouble the water. A band of angels coming after me. God's gonna trouble the water. They're gonna take me to the heavenly place. God's gonna trouble the water. Where the streets are paved with gold and the struggle gates. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Some say you'll never been redeemed. God's gonna trouble the water. Just follow me down to Jordan Street. God's gonna trouble the water. I'll tell you how the Lord has set my soul free. God's gonna trouble the water. And when I get to heaven, how happy I'll be. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade